Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Conserving Catholicism. My name is Nicholas Ramirez, and today I am joined once again by Father Cajetan Cuddy, a friend of the podcast who needs no introduction. Father Cuddy, thank you for coming on.
Happy to be with you. Thank you.
And today we're talking about a book that has just been published with the Emmaus Academic Press at the St. Paul Center, which Father Cajetan Cuddy had a pivotal role in getting out there. And you wrote the introduction to the book, and that is a book by the name of The Essence of Thomism, written by Father Gallus Manser. It's a large work, as you can see, but it is. I have not finished reading it, as I've mentioned to Father Cuddy, but it has been a delight to read thus far. And today we're privileged to have Father Cuddy on to speak a little bit about the book, the author, Father Manser, and a little bit about the thesis of the book of what is the essence of Thomism. So to begin, I figured, Father Cuddy, you have a beautiful introduction to the book, and you have told me as well privately a little bit about Father Manser's influence on your own thought. So I figured we'd just start off by talking a little bit about how is Father Gallus Manser, his thought shaped your understanding of St. Thomas, but more importantly, your understanding of reality.
So I discovered Gallus Manser as an undergrad. And so that was at the Franciscan University of Steubenville about 20 some years ago, 24, 5 years ago. And I did it. So Manser I discovered because of Garrigou, and I discovered Garrigou because of St. Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, of course, was attractive as a figure. Even in high school and junior high, I became interested in Aquinas because he's the one. It's hard to deny, whether one is Catholic or Protestant or a Thomist or not, that this figure presented an overarching, universal, all-inclusive account of the Christian faith and all of the parts. We don't mean exhaustive. Of course, only God's knowledge is exhaustive, but Aquinas was very evidently and deliberately in the Summa Theologiae trying to present an overview of the whole of Sacra Doctrina within a scientific mode. And of course, as anyone knows, it ain't easy to read Aquinas and to reach up, as Bernard Lonergan would say, reach up to the mind of Aquinas. That's hard. And so when I was 17, 18, I discovered then Garrigou-Lagrange, who was basically the last great Thomist in the Thomistic world, as a master who had a great proficiency with St. Thomas's thought and also the Thomist tradition. Those Thomistic disciples of St. Thomas throughout history, who were, through time, through their labors, through the controversies and questions in which they found themselves, germane in particular to their own individual moment in the past, identified certain elements within St. Thomas that were of predominant importance. So that's why Garrigou is important. Garrigou, he gives you a summary of St. Thomas's writing and thought, sure, but even more, to speak a little bit paradoxically, even more valuable is he tells you what are the linchpins, what are the core tenets of St. Thomas's thought and writing, and he identifies a hierarchical priority and posteriority. What are the most first principles, the most first primal and all significant truths? And so reading St. Thomas with Garrigou's help opened my eyes to the lucidity of Aquinas, the profundity of Aquinas, because although everything that Aquinas talks about is important because it's about reality, both natural and supernatural, there's a handful of key things that Aquinas invokes all the time. And if readers, students like you and I have proficiency with them, we can almost begin to predict and to anticipate what Aquinas himself is going to say. And once we see what he's going to say in the text, then we know why he said it that way. And for Garrigou, what clued me into this was the early chapters of Garrigou-Lagrange's book, which was a Thomistic synthesis translated in English and published under the title Reality. And I can still remember I was 17, 18 years old reading Reality in English translation by Garrigou-Lagrange. And he says in chapters 5, 6, 4, 5, and 6, it's kind of the key elements. He says that the Thomistic definition of potency, as really distinct from act, is the heart of the Thomistic synthesis. So Garrigou puts a spotlight. That's an introductory work. It's an overview. But he says at the beginning of Reality, here's what's going on. This is the heart of what makes Thomist, as opposed to Scotists or Bonaventurians or even Albertians, certainly Durandus, the Saint-Pourçans people, etc., alchemists. And I can remember being very like, okay, Garrigou, I'm sure he's right. And so from then on, I just took it as, I say this with tongue in cheek, like small g gospel. Yeah, okay, potency and act, that's what it is. And you'll see then, and when I began to read the whole of the Summa Aquinas, every 5 lines, potency and the act and form and matter are connected to act and potency because form is the actual principle, matter is the potential principle, essence and existence, essence in a composite being, essence has the potential principial nature, existence is a type of actuality. You begin to see this three-dimensionality, and I just saw this more and more confirmed. But anyway, reading Garrigou and Thomists more, I would see in footnotes reference to this man, Gallus Manser, in this very this language that has it's more removed from English than either Latin or French, and that was Gallus Manser's book, The Essence of Thomism, but in German it hadn't been translated. And I early on said, okay, this is clearly, they're all saying this is the book. And so what I began to do is I got a copy of the untranslated, it was translated into Spanish, Manser's book, from the original German. And I began with help from back then. You had things like Babel, Fish, and this is before Google was just starting, Gmail. But there were some early online translational helps, and I basically began to work through some of the Manserian pages from the Essence of Thomism to try to see what he was doing. And even though those early translation online instruments weren't perfect, it was very clear to me that Manser was the figure who explained in an almost universal manner why the real distinction between potency and act is at the heart of St. Thomas's system or synthesis. And so I always filed that away in my mind, and I always knew, even though I had only read Manser in an imperfect manner by typing in paragraphs from Manser German or Spanish and seeing what they said, it was very evident to me that the Garrigou's acceptance of the real distinction of potency and act, he just states it, he articulates why he thinks it, but it wasn't new to him. This was something that had been formalized by his elder brother in the Dominican order, Father Gallus Manser. And so again, Thomas brought me to Garrigou. Garrigou brought me to the Thomist tradition, Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, Banez, Capriles, Norbert del Prado, who has a slightly different view, and then Manser. But that's how I discovered Manser. It was as an undergrad because of the importance that people attributed to Manser in the footnotes, including Edith Stein. This is not just, he wasn't a friend. Edith Stein says, this is the book you want to read if you want to understand the heart of Thomism. She says that. But I'm getting carried away. I'll let you, otherwise there'll be 2 hours and you'll just have had Father Cuddy talking. And so that's not probably what you and your viewers would prefer. So
no, this is great. I was surprised to see the Edith Stein citation in the introduction. And now you mentioned all these figures who are pointing you back to Manser, Edith Stein being one of them, Garrigou, another. And I think you also cite Joseph Pieper as well as pointing back to Manser. And so this is now, as you've mentioned, and as you mentioned in your introduction, this is the first time that Manser is being translated into English. And why do you think, given his importance in the tradition, that this is the first time that English speakers are being introduced to Manser? Why has he? You also mentioned, despite all the citations, that there are many other people in the Anglophone world who have also forgotten Manser, who have looked over him, Thomists, who are metaphysicians as well, who might cite Manser in passing, but you mentioned it doesn't seem like they have actually maybe grappled with the text in full. And so, what do you think is the cause for the kind of forgetfulness of Manser today?
Good question. And I would say the cause of the forgetfulness of Manser comes down to the fact that he was a Swiss Dominican that wrote in German. And except for some German thinkers, philosophers, and theologians like Pieper, like Stein, the Dutch also have kept up. Some people that have read Dutch or can know the Dutch speak every language, those that study in the Netherlands and parts of Belgium. But I would say it's primarily the language. Manser wrote in a very it's a very technical work. And so German is difficult itself, but when you're writing technical philosophy of the Thomist tradition, that is why I think that it had been forgotten. And in addition to, that's the primary reason. At one time, it was also because of the fact that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a little less in the 90s, traditional Thomism was ignored or not appreciated or kind of had declined in popularity. And so that initially was probably also a reason why he had been forgotten. But I would say that what prevented him from being recovered after Garrigou and all these other works that have been translated, people, no one can keep Garrigou Lagrange on the shelf now because everyone wants to read him. Cajetan translations, John of St. Thomas, everyone. But Manser, I think what's prohibited him from coming back into print until now is primarily the German language.
Hmm.
He wrote his doctoral dissertation, which is a short thing. It's hilarious. I know you're a doctoral student yourself, which I'm sure will be hundreds of pages with copious footnotes. His is like 84 pages. It's on physical pre-motion. It's written in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And because you make an argument, there's footnotes, but it's not like we do today. But all of his other writings were in German.
Hmm.
And the Spanish, like I said, the Spanish had translated the Essence of Thomism in the 60s, 50s, maybe even. But yeah, it's a couple editions of the Spanish edition have been out, but nothing in English. And so, if I may, so what I work with Emmaus Academic, I'm on the editorial board, and for a couple of years, they kept talking about translation projects. And I said, you guys, we got to do Manser. And they said to me, well, who's Manser? Exactly. This is why we got to do this. And what's fascinating is it's a catch-22 because every Thomist has seen him in a footnote, but no Thomist has read him. I mean, I talked to some of the world's greatest Thomists. They've never read Manser, like the living ones. Even my dear friend, Matthew Minard, Father Bonino. Minard saw Manser in Whipple's footnotes because he was a student of Whipple, Monsignor Whipple at Catholic U. Bonino had, Rudy Imbach, one of Bonino's collaborators, who's Swiss and speaks German, knew importance of Manser, so Bonino knew, but no one has engaged Manser. And I told Emmaus Academic, they were very gracious, and eventually were sold, and we did it. We got the great Michael J. Miller to do the translation. He's very famous as a translator. And I said, this is the last 20th century Thomist who's a giant that no one's heard of, no one's read. That's both the difficulty to persuade people to discover him, because we've never heard of him. Why should we be interested? But also, that's the benefit. There's going to be other Thomistic figures that wrote an article on this topic or that, or even wrote a book that maybe has been forgotten. Joseph D. Fiance would be another. He's done, his book on being in action, which the French know. He wrote in French, but I think it could be a little more rediscovered in English. There are others who have done significant work, very important Thomists that we can recover. But no one has written 900 pages of a master tome on the essence of Thomism that lays it all out. You're never going to have another work or an author of that centrality and that importance that people have just forgotten. So I told Emmaus Academic, this is an opportunity to do something that is very significant. And the reason why Manser, also his personhood, this isn't a fringe, he didn't live in his mom's basement and, kind of eating coffee beans and scribbling with like a crazed look in his eye. Like, he's not a crazed figure. In the early mid-20th century, Gallus Manser was one of the most important Dominicans in the entire Dominican order, one of the most important philosophers and theologians in the church. And he was known for his brilliance, for his pedagogy, and also he was, as a Swiss Dominican, for multiple terms, the rector of the University of Freiburg. So he was an administrator, he was a leader. I advert to some of this in my introduction. During the course of the First and Second World War, people were understandably very alarmed about what this would mean for the church and for culture, for the spiritual life. And Manser, within Switzerland, at a very respected school, even in its early days, the University of Freiburg, he had to stay the course and make sure that people didn't become discouraged by the chaos of the world, that the neutrality of Switzerland could be reflected in the neutrality of the University of Freiburg, but that would be an opportunity where peace and order could be present, and then profound thoughts and magnanimity of soul. He was very interested in politics and the natural law elements, seeing how it drew out. So, in other words, all of that's to say, Manser had been forgotten because of the German language and because Thomism for a period had been kind of set on the shelf. Thomism is no longer on the shelf, but Manser did remain on the shelf because of the German language. And I am very proud of Emmaus Academic and all of our work together, and Michael J. Miller, very grateful to him, because this is one of the great works in the history of Thomism. And it had been forgotten because of the language. And Miller's translation is very, very good. It's a little technical, but that's not Miller's fault. That's because it's technical. But it is a work that has that the world is primed for, I would say, now more than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we can all agree that Emmaus Academic has been publishing some great translations in recent years, between the translation of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange's work to Matthias Joseph Shaven's work to now Charles Journet as well, his L'Église volumes. So this is a wonderful addition to that. Now, before we jump in, a final thing is you mentioned in the introduction to the book that this isn't a work for beginners. So there might be some people who are eager to know what makes Thomism. But this might be a more intermediate level book, I think is how you put it. So what do you think puts this book on that category, and what would you recommend, I guess, to individuals who are want to read Manser, but maybe who are a little bit less firm in Thomism, as just kind of propaedeutics, or just kind of like beginning introductory things to prime them to receive what Manser's writing?
So those are good questions. And I would say the first thing, I would say that precisely because Manser is advanced, this is not a book for beginners, as you say, as I said in the introduction, that's why the time is right. The recovery of Garrigou, who is himself a master Thomist, the last master Thomist, but he's writing at a level that it comes out of his coursework, a lot of his writings. And so he's writing to give first and second cycle guys and students an overview. Manser's up here. Now, in our contemporary moment, those that are interested in Thomas and the Thomists, they know Garrigou. They've read his De Revelatione. They've read his Summa commentaries. They've read his spiritual writings. And so precisely because Garrigou is familiar, we have living Thomists who are writing books that are, working on an introductory level, or even if they aspire to a certain kind of profundity, They're not, and this is not an insult against them because it makes them readable. They facilitate a common language and a common mode of discourse that more or less people that want to be a Thomist are familiar with or can get familiar with and can be comfortable with. Once you have that, eventually there's going to be people, and I think they're already coming because it's selling very well for Emmaus, the book, who say, I want the next level. Where do I go? So you could go to John of St. Thomas directly, or Cajetan directly, or Banyas and Samar and Billowart, and that's wonderful. But in terms of a 20th century bridge that connects us to the classical greats like John and Cajetan and Caprielus and Banyas, Del Prado, Manser is hard to beat Manser. So that's the first thing, is the time is right for Manser because Thomism is in and people are ready for a little more, a little higher, a little more depth. Second thing, Manser invites, he'll stretch you. And I love it. Like, one of my favorite passages, and I gently advert to this in his in the introduction, but the chapter 3, section 4, where he talks about primacy, the principle of non-contradiction. And you see, now he was friends, like Garrigou Lagrange and he and others, and they had mutual admiration. There's no, hard feelings or anything like that. But he calls Garrigou and says, I think you don't appreciate fully, in terms of the principial priority and posteriority, the hierarchy, just how foundational the real distinction between being and non-being is, and then the principle of non-contradiction. And when you see how he lays out what Garrigou says, and of course he knows Garrigou, they're on the same page, but just, okay, what is Garrigou arguing? When you see him engage Garrigou Lagrange and say, okay, there's a slight precision that I think would benefit your project, Father Garrigou, it's stunning. Because you see a master Thomist speaking with another master Thomist and helpfully offering some slight precision refinements that are actually not insignificant. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, what other work by someone who is on the same page, as it were, could you have and witness a master Thomist who's got the principles so deeply embedded in his habitual knowledge and being that he's able to even offer precisions for Garrigou Lagrange. And so the reason I bring that up is because I would assume most people who read Manser have already read some Garrigou, have already read some Maritain, have already read some Gilles Son, Charles de Connick. And so that's helpful, because if you've read a little bit of those people and their works, Manser's still going to be a little bit elusive, but not such that you can't get a hold on. And if you work and carefully go over passages and arguments, you'll be pulled up by Manser. If one is just getting into Thomism, I would say don't start with Manser. You could. It wouldn't be the worst thing, but Garrigou, Maritain, others might be particularly Garrigou's book, Reality, which gives you an overview, very short, concise chapters. It's online for free on EWTN's website, Reality, Garrigou Lagrange. I would say read that as kind of like a shortcut beginner's prep for Manser. But ultimately, the best way to get into Manser is just to get into Manser. And if you have kind of the basic sense of the principles down, it's going to be a little hard going, but it's always rewarding. Finally, one contemporary book I would recommend is Stephen A. Long's book, Analogia Entis. Because what you see there, he's not doing the Manser thing exactly, but you see a masterful Thomist like Stephen Long, Professor Long, deftly invoking, utilizing, and clarifying things in light of potency and act. So that will help you get the familiarity with potency and act and its importance in the question of the analogy of being, so that when you come to Manser, he just expands it out to the whole of philosophy and even theological doctrines. Professor Long's book, which is a little book, Analogia Entis, just read it for the potency and act stuff, which is most of it. That would be another very useful work to get into Manser. to figure out how principles work, why they're important, how they're distinct but connected from causes. Principle is that from which something proceeds in any way whatsoever. A cause is that from which something proceeds but depends upon it for being. So there's overlap. So getting those kinds of things, see, form and matter, essence, existence, act and potency, understanding how they correlate, how they're distinct from each other. But those three types of distinction, form, matter, essence, existence, essence, and act and potency, how they're distinct, how they integrate. If you have a little background in that, when you get into Manser, it'll be much more easy. It'll be easier to see what he's doing. But he's a remarkable thinker, remarkable, and even those master Thomists will not be bored by this work because you have a great mind inviting you to higher things. And yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say I think one of the benefits of being a part of a school, a tradition of thought, is that you have agreement on foundational principles, but you can then have, in light of that agreement, further disagreement or dive deeper into maybe how the principles are arranged, how one kind of illuminates the other, which takes primacy, and so to see a dispute, let's say among two masters like Garrigou and Manser, isn't reflective of some kind of strong fighting or anything like that, but it is simply the benefit of having these more profound agreements, and then trying to just through dialectic, through argumentation, try to dive deeper into the truth of how reality is kind of structured overall. But it requires that kind of tradition, that school, to be able to facilitate that, whether it's Thomism, Scotism, whatever it might be. That tradition allows you that kind of framework and that ability to do that.
Absolutely. It's precisely because Garrigou and Manser both believe potency and act was at the heart of the whole Thomistic synthesis that they could clarify and help each other with their respective precisions. Because what that whole point is, with the primacy of the principle of non-contradiction, is to say, Garrigou, if you clarify this about the principle of non-contradiction, that's a stronger foundation, a more necessary demonstration for what leads to the potency and act stuff that we do agree about. So in other words, it's agreement leading to greater precision, not fundamentally diametric opposed. Yeah. And that's where a lot of people, just to zoom out, if I may, a lot of people think, oh, the Thomists are always fighting with each other. It's like, that's a compliment.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you agree about key and critical pillar type elements and principles, then from that point of agreement, you can work together to get even more precise in each other's minds and hearts about the most important things. So just to say this, it's one thing. Or let's say I write a book and you're the famous Nicholas Ramirez, master philosopher and theologian, and I want to get an endorsement from you, which of course I would. So I'll ask you, Professor Ramirez, this is in the future, could you endorse my book? You could say, oh, this book by Father Cuddy is a very interesting and insightful thing that will benefit many people. And I strongly encourage people to read it. That's nice. I will put that on the back of my book with great pride. But we all know you could have just flipped through the book, looked at the table of contents and looked at some of the headings, and we're friends. And that could have been enough for you to write those words. Now, let's say rewind the tape. I write the same book. And rather than you writing an endorsement, being a masterful Thomist of the next few years, you write an article length, nuanced and critical engagement with the book. Where you say, now Father Cuddy says X, Y, and Z. I'm okay with X, Y, and Z. But then he pivots to A, B, and C, and he writes A, B, and C as if they were the numbers 1, 2, and 3. I don't think that's now. And here's how his argument are. And you really, you write an article. What is actually more complementary to my work? On one level, we might say, well, it's a nice little blurb. But if you really look at what took you more time, what showed respect from you, you only engage someone at that depth if you respect their work. And so within the Thomist tradition, the criticality of the Thomist, and even the criticality of Thomist per Scotus or Occamist, the nominalist, Durandus, Gabriel Beale, that's not a sign of disrespect. That's a sign of profound respect to say that, okay, your alternative arguments are formidable enough that I will invest the time, the energy, the paper, the pen, the quill, the ink, to thinking very carefully and systematically through your argument and then offering an alternative. And so part of the beauty, now we're coming back into the Thomist school, is that the brothers and sisters in Thomism, whenever you're critiqued by a brother Thomist or a sister Thomist, it's not an insult, it's a compliment, because they're saying your ideas are worthy of critical engagement. To put it in a nutshell, it's a sign of greater respect and more investment in time to write a critical engagement with a work than it is to give a glowing but shallow positive blurb.
There you go.
And the Thomists do that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. So, I mean, with that, I think we're now primed to just jump into Manser's argument in this book. And you've already alluded to it briefly, but his thesis, and correct me if I'm putting it incorrectly, but simply put, is that what's at the heart of Thomism as a school of thought, and I think you mentioned this in your introduction. We've also discussed this on the podcast before. What distinguishes different Catholic schools of thought? True Catholic schools of thought is not theology. They agree on the articles of faith. That's what makes them Catholic. So what distinguishes them are the philosophical tools and presuppositions that they bring into their theology. And so Manser zooms in on the real distinction between act and potency as the key distinction that really kind of makes Thomism to be what it is. Is that a good way of characterizing that initially?
Certainly. Thank you. No, that's a very perspicacious and accurate read of Manser. So if I may, what I'll say is what you've just articulated is I was saying Manser as Cuddy uses him. So what my introduction does is it attempts to give a brief summary of Manser, but then show how the Manserian thesis about the real distinction of potency and act has implications for a lot more than even what Manser explicitly states in the book. Mm-hmm. And so you have kindly and helpfully identified what I think Manser's value is even for non-Thomists. Because you're right, if we want to talk about what makes a Catholic theologian, it can't be the articles of faith, because that would presuppose if you and I are distinguished in the level of faith, that means you have different revelation than I do, which means either you have a different God or a different church because you have a different deposit than I do. It's very problematic. But we know in the real church, throughout her history, there's one faith, one baptism, and yet there are different schools of theology. So where does that come from? And what I argue is that the Manserian thesis about the essence of Thomism can be expanded, or I should say applied, to account for how Scotus, Bonaventure, de Lubac, Garrigou-Lagrange, Thomas Aquinas, Ratzinger can all be authentic Catholic theologians and yet be really distinct and disagree. And so if the articles of faith, a distinction within the order of faith, can't account for distinctions within Catholic theology, then it has to be something outside the order of faith that's relevant and applicable to, presupposed by, the order of faith. And that would be our philosophical principles. So all Thomists and Scotists and Bonaventurians and or any Orthodox Catholic believes this is my body, divine revelation. Now, what we think is means, or a body means, or this, even what this means, will affect what we think the Lord, and that's what theology is, faith seeking understanding. In faith, this is my body. Amen. But what do we understand this to mean? Faith seeking understanding. that's where the different philosophical presuppositions come to bear. So that's where I think Manser is ironically and paradoxically, perhaps, he can actually provide, and I've tried to use him for this in numerous places, to account for, in an inclusive and diversity openness way, a theory of a plurality of religious schools, of theological schools. Who would have thought a crusty Swiss Thomist of the strict observance, to use the pejorative titles that people have used against him, a Cajetanist, as one reviewer might cite that in the introduction, he would actually be able to account for the openness of the church to many different schools. But I think Manser can. And so what Manser himself, however, so that's my kind of utilization and expansion of Manser application. But Manser, he's basically walking through looking at the history of Thomas and Thomism, but then he walks through the different core elements of Thomistic philosophy and argues that potency and act is at the heart of them all. And what's funny is, and he even adverts to this in the introduction, and earlier, this is one of the later editions of the book that we translated. In earlier ones, there was even more, because he went through natural law stuff. He went through a little of the political stuff. He said, I took that out of this edition, and he published them separately. But early editions of the Essence of Thomism, he literally says, I'm going to talk about everything and show how it all comes back to potency and act. It's like the film My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Give me a word, any word, and I'll show you the Greek origin of it. Manser says, give me a reality, any reality, and I'll show you how potency and act is at the heart of it. And that's where it's both pellucid and it's both charming, but it can also be fatiguing because it's that Swiss precision. Let's walk through everything, and almost everything is covered in the Essence of Thomism, from universals, knowledge, transcendental ideas, transcendental relations, causality, the movement to God, analogy, participation, physical pre-motion, human nature. He looks at everything in light of this. I remember talking with a European Thomist, a layman, not a Dominican, and we were getting to know each other at a conference a few years ago in Rome. And as we're walking up one of the hills in Rome, beautiful, he asked me who's had the most impact on my thought. I said, oh, Garrigou Lagrange, but definitely Gallus Manser in terms of modern people. And he goes, yeah, I read Manser. He's a Dutchman. He goes, I read Manser, but man, everything he thinks is potency. And I said, yes, and that's one of the glories, is that it works. And one of the other, historically, one of the things that's interesting about Manser's, it's not a hermeneutic, it's not an imposition. I think for in our very historically conscious time, this is also relevant, the Manserian thesis, because Scotus is interesting for Thomists. Why does Scotus and Molina always attract the attention of Thomists? Again, that's a compliment. But Scotus specifically, right now, why is Scotus always the one that you read the classic commentators, every 5 lines are like, okay, now we got to show why Scotus is wrong. You're like, not again. It's because Scotus is brilliant and he's an Aristotelian. So on one level, if that's enough to be an Aristotelian, to be a Catholic theologian, to be a religious, the Thomists are always like, why are we and Scotus in such disagreement? And what's fascinating is that Scotus, famously, and the Jesuit tradition, Suarez and Molina, Suarez is the most metaphysical and philosophical, I should say. Even his philosophy of the potency and act is not just metaphysical, also the level of physics. They're both evidently and overtly, they deny the real distinction of potency and act. And so what you see with Scotus is a way to understand the history of medieval and scholastic thought, wherein you had 2 philosophers and 2 theologians giving birth to, engendering 2 schools of thought, Scotism and Thomism. How are they both using and appreciating Aristotle, but coming to radically different conclusions about a lot of things? And it's really this. Thomas and Scotus, and therefore Thomism and Scotism, both appreciate the real distinction, or I should say both appreciate Aristotle, but Scotus doesn't see a real distinction between potency and act. And therefore that principle configures his thought in philosophy and in the sacred doctrine of theology in this way. Thomas does, and that configures it in this way. And so that's the important thing. Now, if I may, one of the things we're not saying is that no other principles, no other distinctions are relevant. That's what we're not saying. With Manser's just saying that this is a after the principle of non-contradiction and being and non-being. When you start working within the plurality of being, this is the principle that you're using. So it's not the only, but it's the first and most all-encompassing. But there are other principles. The second thing, some might think, well, or Manser, he's reflecting a movement of the past, and maybe you and I, Nick, by talking about it, are trying to reimpose a thesis-based account of thought, which the church wisely has perhaps moved past that. We're no longer 24 theses, this is not. I think they're all wonderful. I think they're all true, but the church is not mandating that everyone cannot be 24 thesis Thomists anymore. Does this not render Thomism a thesis oriented? And I would say, no, we don't need 24. We just need one. That's all. That's all we want. I had a famous Thomist. I gave a lecture on this. He came up. This was also in Europe, and he says, he says, I see what you're saying, and it makes sense. He says, but I'm a little hesitant to reopen the thesis-based Thomism. I don't think the church wants one. I said, no. Well, we're not offering for one. We just need one. We can print it on like a fortune cookie paper. That's all we need. Just one. Because all the 24 theses are ultimately just different expressions and clarifications, unpacking of the principle of potency and act, the real distinction.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. That's what he's doing.
Yeah. And I think that's very helpful, both the clarification and also putting it in contradistinction with someone like Scotus to see kind of, that, okay, this is actually a real disagreement at the heart of these two schools. And, not just these two schools, others as well. So, I mean, with that, I mean, let's, unpack this, I guess, a little bit in terms of how does the Thomist understand the real distinction between act and potency, and why are those two concepts, the distinction between act and potency, important for philosophy, but particularly for the Thomist?
So those are wonderful questions, and if I may, I'll just say something preliminary, because this has been observed, and I'm happy it's been observed as a kind of a propedeutic to that precise speculative question. And it would be the nuance between Gallus Manser, who identifies potency and act, that real distinction, as at the heart of the Thomistic synthesis, so to speak, and Norbert del Prado, another Freiburg figure, in his work on Christian philosophy, where he argues that the real distinction of essence and existence is the heart of the Thomistic synthesis. Now, several observations. First, Manser and del Prado agree that potency and act are really distinct, and that essence and existence are really distinct. They're both thoroughly masterful Thomists. I think del Prado's another one we need to recover. But they differ in that del Prado argued that essence and existence, that real distinction, is the heart, and Manser, potency and act. And what I would say, and we won't go through it now, but in the introduction, I side with Manser, because the real distinction of essence and existence doesn't ultimately dissolves when you get to God. Because in God, essence and existence are not really distinct. They're both there, and they're identical. But with potency and act, when you get to God, the real distinction obtains, because you don't have potency at all. You don't have matter at all. You only have pure act. And so, just to say that for those of our viewers who are Thomistically alert and might smile with amusement that, well, Thomists get, it's just a little bit of preference. Manser likes P and A, potency and act, and del Prado likes, E and E, essence and existence. And no, there's speculative reasons for, in my judgment, going with Manser as opposed to del Prado. even though all of Del Prado's argumentation of essence and existence is profound and useful, it's just on this point we're talking about really the hierarchy. And as you saw in my introduction, what I argue, and this gets us now to your question more directly, potency and act comes at the beginning of contemplation of reality and the physics, and then it comes up at the very end at the heights of metaphysics and in the Sacra Doctrina. And essence and existence, it's at the height of metaphysics, but it's not evident immediately in the physics. So what's fascinating is potency and act begins and culminates in the philosophic and even the theological order of discourse and contemplation. Now, why potency and act? So here we're much indebted to the wisdom and the insight and the perceptiveness of Aristotle. Aristotle recognized that reality is confusing and strange. How do we understand it? And here, this is where a lot of philosophers we all benefit from, and I love returning to them regularly, but the pre-Socratics, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Zeno, we just have fragments of their writings, but basically most of the questions in philosophy, which again, philosophy is just the human mind trying to understand reality, we haven't gotten past them because those pre-Socratic figures in ancient Greece were so brilliant. They were asking the most important questions that never grew out of style. And fundamentally, the question that Aristotle inherited from them is how can something change and be different, but also still be what it is? Of course, Parmenides said that, well, if it is, it is. So he denied change is real. Then you get Heraclitus, who thought everything was changing. And so these Socratic, the pre-Socratics were trying to grapple with, we know, we intuit, we can observe continuity in change or motion, growth, movement, expansion, corruption. We can observe motion. We can also continuity. We can also observe discontinuity. How do we reconcile this? And what Aristotle discovered, he didn't invent potency, he discovered it, was that you have an underlying principle in being and reality, but also that can be understood. Principles are in beings and in knowledge, and therefore they can unite knowledge, be instruments that unite us cognitively to being. Potency articulates how something can be but not be actual. And that's the real distinction, is he identifies, not exhaustively, not completely, but that being is not just existence and non-existence, or act and non-act, but there is a type of reality called potency, which is real but not actual. So it's real. Therefore, it exists, but it exists not as act or as existence. And again, for listeners or viewers that are like very confused, read Garrett Lagrange's book on the principles of being and potency and act, those chapters in reality. He lays it out. So the reason why potency and act is really distinct, is important for Aristotle, and then supremely important for the Thomists, is because this seemingly is the only way to account for continuity and diversity and change in reality. Without potency and act is really distinct. You're either a monist, everything's one, which ends up in pantheism, which seems to go against all common sense and even divine revelation. Or you end up in, an absolute kind of, it just goes against all knowledge. And so potency and act then accounts for unity in reality, but also diversity. Now, what Thomas did is he clarified that not only are potency and act really distinct, which they are, but he clarified the nature of that distinction, and he clarifies that potency receives and limits act. And so that's the Thomistic contribution. There have been many philosophers that have dabbled in what is it, like Norris Clark, the great Jesuit metaphysician, Maritain, Garrigou himself, Monsignor Whipple has looked at this, and we could go on and on. But so Thomas then, as understanding the reality of potency, wasn't just parroting or regurgitating Aristotelian conceptions of being, but he also applied his mind to understanding what precisely that potency and act real distinction, how is it really distinct? And so potency is really distinct from act, but as something that a capacity to receive and limit act on the level of principles. Now, once you have that, this is where Gallus Manser and Thomas and the Thomists would run with it. This is the dynamic of all of reality. All contingent being is not absolute. God alone is pure act. That's why there's no shadow of turning within him. There's no change. There's no growth. There's no learning. Those processes, those motions, those developments would require a principle of potency. God has none of that. But in us, who can grow, who can be augmented, who can develop, and also can decline and corrupt, every being that we encounter and every process, every actuality, every operation of every being that we encounter in reality is working within the matrix and the framework of these two principles. And so that opens up science and philosophy. And I come from the classical view, which would view kind of what we call science today is physics, ultimately. The philosopher's job and the scientist's, the physicist's job are ultimately not really distinct. But so there's no situation in which potency and act are not relevant, because anytime we're trying to understand real beings that really change, we're working in potency and act. And it's the great mystery. How is it possible? It's not as if everything becomes clear. Like, this isn't just like the X-ray vision goggles that opens up, oh, everything's obvious now. I got potency and act. I can see. No, there are some paradoxes. For example, those, whether you classify something as alive or not, organic or not, like the biologists and the physicists can point to this. How do we deal with the fact that in some, types of animate life forms, you can cut off the head and it'll grow another, or something like that. It'll grow another tail. Well, what's going on there? So potency and act is not the magic key that solves every natural mystery, but it is the principial basis for every legitimate scientific conclusion about the change that we see in reality. Now, one last thing. How does this apply to sacred doctrine and theology? Because we've been dealing with something that's philosophical and scientific, naturally knowable. It comes back to what we said earlier. By arguing that potency and act is at the heart of the Thomistic synthesis, we're not thereby reducing Aquinas to a philosopher. He's a theologian, absolutely, formally, professionally, religious professionally, and academic. He made profession of the faith, and he taught. He's canonically instituted as a professor, a master of sacred theology. So none of this, I want to be very clear, runs the risk of reducing Aquinas to a philosopher or of compromising his theological credentials and project. No, he's a theologian more than he's a philosopher. And that's why this is so relevant, because anytime, what does the theologian do? Faith seeking understanding. And anytime we have an article of faith or a truth of faith, the moment we try to understand it, our conceptions of being and reality are immediately relevant. So that's where this distinction about potency and act is relevant to understanding God as pure act and understanding what God does in our being and lives by changing us by grace. We're not just changed physically or naturally by growing or learning math or calculus, but we're also changed by grace, gifts of the Holy Spirit, divine motions. So when God enters, what is the Christian life? The Christian life, even with supernature, you're working within the order of potency and act, because you're talking about real beings that can change.
That's great. That that's fantastic. I think your point as well about focusing on the fact that this doesn't reduce St. Thomas to a philosopher. I mean, he does certainly fantastic philosophy, but he is also a theologian, and so you have this great integration between it. I think kind of your point as well, the life of grace, this is where you see, these concepts of act and potency in initially kind of their um, uh, origin being a response to pre-Socratic questions about change and motion kind of play out in a supernaturalized sense, where you have to explain with the creature who is elevated by grace. Uh, okay, there's a difference here between the creature who's not in the state of grace and the creature that's in the state of grace, and there's a movement from not being in grace to being in grace. But then there must also be a kind of principle of identity or unity in that, because if not, then it's not the same creature who goes from being absent the state of grace to being in the state of grace. So I think already where we're beginning to kind of see the theological import, why this is an important tool, and maybe the important tool, as the Thomists would argue, as Manser would argue, for theology, and so what I would like to do is just kind of get your thoughts maybe on kind of like one or two key places. It could be philosophical, but I think it'd be interesting as well for especially the theologians who maybe there are some people doing theology today who think, oh well, philosophy, that's nice, but it's that's outside of my wheelhouse. I don't really need to focus on that. But to show maybe one or two places where you think really the distinction between act and potency kind of shine in theology, or in solving kind of certain theological questions, or at least getting you closer to answers about how to think through certain theological questions.
So thank you. I would say the first that my mind goes immediately as an example to something that all Christians and therefore Christian theologians are concerned about, and that's our incarnate Lord. So we have one divine person with two natures, is what the councils have defined and clarified for us. And whether we're Protestant or Catholic, any traditional Orthodox theologian of Christian persuasion, follows the Christological councils. And so Jesus, we have him. But what's going on in our Lord? That's very elusive. The Christological mystery is profound. And so potency and act then enables us to maintain both the distinction between the divine nature, which is pure act in our Lord, from his human nature, which is potency and act, naturally composite. And then because Christ's human soul, which is a potency and act composite, naturally was always filled with grace, which comes from the divine nature. Basically, to say it like this, without potency and act, it's hard to avoid fusing the human and divine natures of Christ into one. It'd be hard not to run the risk of doing that, because you wouldn't be able to maintain with clarity the distinction between person and nature, or persons and natures in the case of our Lord, divine person, two natures. You might end up with kind of a fused together natural, supernatural, just one nature. Or on the other hand, you might end up in Nestorianism, where you don't just have a distinction of natures, but now you got a distinction of persons going on and all of that. And it's potency and act that enables us to see clearly how within our Lord, truly God, truly man, like us in all things but sin, how that is really distinct and yet never separated, and how the two natures work together, so to speak, how the divine nature works through the human nature in the single hypostasis, supposit of Christ's personhood acting. Without potency and act, it's very hard to explain in a word the church's traditional Christological teachings. So that would be the first. And in Aquinas' Christology, you see him adverting to potency and act again and again and again. So the distinction between Christ's human nature and divine nature, and also their integration within, their theandric operational activity integration within Christ's, the things he did and said. The other way I would go to it is with regard to what we've already talked about, which would be salvation and grace. We haven't, it's so evident, you've said it so well just now, but how is it that I can, my nature, because I'm a human person, could be the same as Adam and Eve, even when they were created in a state of grace, original justice. Then they committed the first sin, which leads to them suffering the state of original sin. We recall that original sin is not an act, it's a condition. It's not committed, it's contracted. And how then, so I received that, I'm born with that original sin, but then through baptism, now I don't have original sin because grace is given, I'm elevated. And yet, we're still a human person. We still have a human nature. We're not completely different. And why is this important? This is important because for the theologian, without the principles of continuity and also discontinuity in the Christian grace and redemption and sin and forgiveness and mercy process, it's impossible for us to explain what salvation really means. Because as you just said moments ago, wonderfully, if there is no principle of continuity between my original sin pre-baptized state and my post-baptism grace state, if there's no continuity, we don't have salvation. We have a new creation in the literal sense. The old me is gone, annihilated. That can't work. That's not salvation. That's a new creation. And conversely, if we want to say that, well, but you're right, it's really the same. Not much is different. Then we're in Pelagianism and sadness and despair and Jansenism because grace didn't really do anything to me. I need to have principles that enable me to make sense of what Jesus says. You will be saved. There needs to be a you that's continual, and there needs to be a real saving change. And without potency and act, you can't really explain that. Because again, potency and act, we discover they're a real distinction when we look at motion or change. That's from physics, looking at ens mobile. My little nieces and nephews, I have, 7 or 8 of them. I know them all individually, but I haven't counted them. So don't let listeners think I don't love my nieces and nephews. I do. I just can't, I have to go through them. Anyway, when they're outside, what is that? Well, they're looking at, they want to touch things, they want to feel things, they want to taste things. That's all. They're just discovering motion and change, potency and act. And what's beautiful about this is that all the way from the simple little toddler to the highest philosopher, and then even above the highest theologian, there's there's continuity there too. This is where some might say that the danger of recovering what Manser saw is that you end up with an elitistic kind of conception of theology. Oh, only the super philosophical kind of people can do theology. It's like, no, potency and act, form, matter, essence, existence, substance, accident, that can be explained to a child. And then the highest theologian can also apply his or her full mental capacities to that and never exhaust. So what's beautiful about what Manser saw, which is what Thomas saw, was that there is no real break or level or stages that you graduate from in the contemplation of reality, naturally and supernaturally. And so my hope is that if the more we get into what Manser saw, and he's not perfect, we can disagree with him, pay him that compliment, offer more precisions. But what his fundamental conviction about reality opens up natural and supernatural contemplation to all people, rather than, as it often is, many grad students, and we all were, you are, and I was, you kind of feel at times that I'm doing a higher thing because I'm reading these important thinkers, these books. My grandmother, my aunt, my next door neighbor, they're not really doing theology or philosophy. Because if academics becomes the study of theologians, or as I call it, theologianology, that ends up becoming an elite discipline. You got to know the Greek, the Latin, the German, the French. And if you don't know the history, you don't know anything about the creed or anything about reality. All of that's important, but what Garrigou, Manser, Thomas, all the Thomists have is it's a track that everyone from my little 3-year-old niece all the way up to the wisest person on the planet can enter into. So this is the most non-elitistic method I even don't like the word method in this context, but this is the most non-elitistic description of what it is to know and love reality and God, because it's open to everybody. Yeah.
That's great. Now, if I'm a theologian, sitting here and I hear this, I say, okay, Father Cuddy, I'm sold. Act and Potency, very important for understanding the Christian life. But now, however, going back to Manser's thesis, okay, now that I believe in the real distinction, does that mean I'm a Thomist? Or can you agree with the distinction but not be a Thomist? What's the criteria here in terms of thinking about
It's a
being
good,
a Thomist?
interesting. I would say you could be concede the real distinction, but not be a Thomist. And here, this is where I would invoke definition of a Thomist, which most people invoke at the very beginning. So for me, the first step for what is a Thomist is adherence to the real distinction of potency and act. Most people would say first, and I would put it second, and that is also a devotion to following Aquinas's working out of that. So I don't define a Thomist as someone who adheres exactly to everything Aquinas says or uses Aquinas, because then the church would be Thomistic, and the church is not Thomistic. She doesn't get specified by an Italian Dominican priest. I'm sorry. She gets specified by our Lord. So it can't be the case that we define Thomists or Thomism as simply an appreciation of Aquinas' writings or thought. No. And yet there is an element of that. So for me, Thomism is first and foremost specified by the consistent and universal application, vertically in terms of depth and profundity, extensively in terms of all of the other doctrines of the real distinction of potency and act. But it's possible someone say, no, that's true, potency and act are really distinct. But I also, I'm not gonna follow that all the way out systematically and consistently with Aquinas' help. I'd say, fine, you don't have to be, you don't have to do that. And so in that case, I would say you can, and I have friends who are like this, they would say potency and act are really distinct, but they're just interested in other things. They invoke other principles and other observations, other methods. And so I would say I would not force them to wear the Thomistic badge if they didn't want to. And I would say that here we do see kind of the devotion to Aquinas' thought as being important in the definition of a Thomist, even if secondary. Because again, if we make devotion or appreciation of Aquinas' thought primary for being a Thomist, then we got to give the church the Thomistic badge. That is backwards. We know the church is not Thomistic. She's bigger. She transcends that.
Amen. Yeah, we can maybe say that the most formal part of the definition of being a Thomist is the adherence to the real distinction between act and potency. The material part, though, is being a follower of St. Thomas, an admirer of St. Thomas, one who wants to take up St. Thomas as an intellectual guide, perhaps.
Amen.
So before we wrap up, I want to be mindful of your time. Just kind of question of curiosity, a fun question before we leave off is besides Manser and Garrigou, who would you say is this a Thomist who you think is a kind of a figure that really embodies like what a great Thomist is?
So several names come to mind, a lot of names now that I'm thinking more. I would say someone that's kind of in between Garrigou and Manser and Garrigou, in terms of readability and exhaustive kind of, would be Norbert del Prado, whom I've already mentioned. He wrote a work on Christian philosophy, never been translated, marvelous. And his 3-volume works on grace and human freedom, excellent. I would also go back a little further and say Charles René Billouart, marvelous. In fact, he was like Garrigou before Garrigou. His Cursus Theologicus gives a very nice overview of the whole of Sacra Doctrina from Thomistic principles in a very distilled way. Another one who's very important as well is Jean-Baptiste Gonnet, French Thomist. He wrote the Clipius Thomistice, the shield of Thomism, And what he does there is he appreciates formidable forces in the world at his time that are calling into question the faith, calling into question of reality, calling into question of truth. And he walks through the speculative and theoretical arenas with them with that shield and says, look, truth is knowable, God is real, salvation is possible. Vincent Contenson, Vincent Contenson, is in Latin, the theology of mind and heart, is ripe for rediscovery because when we think of high spiritual theology, now all the Thomists know that the intellectual life and the spiritual life are united. And Contenson, as we would say in English, he devotes a lot of writing to showing how that's the case. And then I got to say, there's some of the other Thomists that are very interesting on questions of grace and freedom, like Thomas Lemos, Alvarez, others who they didn't do a comprehensive work on the whole, but they did get into very complicated questions and showed how to approach them in a way that is helpful, even if one might not go with them the full distance. But in a word, I would say if someone were to rediscover Del Prado and Billowart, in addition to Manser and Garrigou, after kind of the post-John of St. Thomas figures, they would be in good shape. Yeah.
Perhaps that would make a good next translation project. Well, Father, right. Thank you so much for your time. If people want to just hear more from you about Thomism, Catholicism, where can they go to?
You can go to two places. One, Dr. Matthew Mine and I co-write for our own kind of online journal called To Be a Thomist, which can be found at athomist.com. And also, I'm the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, which is an online and in print publication of Venue Media, which is ect.org, the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology.org. We have a YouTube page with media, theological, philosophical conversations, reflections on Mass readings. But basically, ect.org and athomist.com. I'm probably lurking around there online if people are inclined to search me out.
Yeah, I'll link both of those in the description, and I'm a big fan of ECT. They have these great handbooks as well. You can see Father Cuddy's here on an introduction to Catholic theology, as well as moral theology, introduction to natural philosophy. So it's a fantastic resource, and I think that the Church will greatly benefit from it. So with that, thank you, Father Cuddy, again for your time.
Thank you, Nicholas.